Those of you that have been following my channel over the last few months will know that I've recently made the switch from Lightroom to Capture One to edit my photographs. If you're new to the channel or you've just come across this video out of the blue, then check out this video at the top of the screen now if you'd like to learn all about why I made that decision. One of the reasons I made the decision was because of the powerful nature of the colour editing options within the program. Now, I'm aware that other pieces of software do colour editing very well, so just because this video is going to be done in Capture One doesn't mean that it isn't going to be relevant to you, so I would recommend that you keep watching. In my search for colour editing tutorials, and in particular colour grading tutorials using Capture One, I found that the majority of videos out there were all about portraiture or maybe street photography, generally photographs to do with people. And predominantly I would call myself a landscape photographer, and there wasn't a huge amount of options out there for me to learn how to implement those colour edits and colour grading on landscape photographs in particular. Now, there may be a few reasons for that. One being that we can often get very good colours out of our camera when it comes to landscape photography, and sometimes minor tweaks on the white balance, the temperature, the contrast and also vibrance and saturation can just make subtle changes but make a huge difference to our photograph, and it might not be necessary to push that photograph into the realms of specific colour editing. But there are some situations where I think colour editing, and in particular colour grading, can really have an influence on our photographs and get them back to that intent that we had when we made them. So in this latest episode of the Basics of Photography from Yorkshire Photo Walks, we're going to be looking at colour grading and colour edits for landscape photography. Before we delve into the software and I show you a few examples of good practice when it comes to colour editing and colour grading, I think we should just go through the differences and what these terms actually mean. Many of you may not have even come across them and known that these things are options before. So first of all, basic colour editing or colour correction is basically the process of making sure that the colours within our photograph are exactly how we intended them to be when we made the photograph in the first place. And often I will encourage people that come on my photo walks to make that as real as it possibly can be, i.e. as close to the original scene that you saw when you made that photograph as possible. When it comes to colour grading, this is basically the tone or hue across the photograph that maybe implements a certain mood on the picture. So we can often do that by changing the white balance, which changes the temperature of our photograph. So we can cool it down or we can warm it up depending on the subject matter and the feeling that we want to get across from that photograph. But colour grading goes a step further, where we can start to slightly change the saturation, the hue, and various different tonalities of the midtones, the shadows and the highlights of the photograph that in certain circumstances, as we'll see in a moment, can have a huge difference compared to changing the tone or temperature like you would do in white balance adjustments when it comes to affecting the whole photograph. Through colour grading, we can pick out certain areas of the photograph that we would like to concentrate on and really show that mood and feeling that we intended to get across when we were making the photograph in the first place. I think it's really important to stress that not every photograph that we ever take will warrant colour grading or colour corrections. But there are certain circumstances where it can work really well. So I've picked out a few images that I'm going to show you, and these are instances where I've thought that actually, instead of changing the white balance or just tweaking the saturation and hue slightly, I could get a better result out of this image. So let's delve into the software and have a look. This is a photograph that I featured in my last Basics of Photography video, where we discussed how to take snowy landscape photos. And in that video, I mentioned that when you make a photograph and we lose a bit of that crisp white nature of the snow, one of the easiest ways that you can redress that balance is by changing the white balance. But what you will often find, especially in a scene like this where we've got a warm sun in the photograph, that it will have the effect of cooling down the whole of the photograph, making that sun a little less intense and maybe not how you intended that scene to look, and definitely not how you saw that scene when you physically made the photograph. And I think this is a good example of that from a photograph that I took whilst I was filming that video. And it's one that I'm going to use as an example to show how different sorts of colour edits can have different effects and different feels to the photographs that we make. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is just change the basic colour profile of this photograph to Pro Standard, which fits the camera that I'll use to make this photograph, which is a Nikon Z6, and also the profile that's given to the software as well, to make sure that the colours are as natural and as accurate as they possibly can be. Now, I've already done a few preliminary edits on this photograph in terms of clarity and exposure and structure and things like that, just to bring a bit of life back into it, as you can see from that before and after. So in this video we are definitely concentrating mainly on colour. So let's go across to our white balance here, and I mean we can select different areas of the photograph, like this blue area up here, which is going to change it to very yellowy nature across the whole photograph. We could pick an area of the sun around here, and that's going to change it to being very blue. And what we find across the whole of the photograph is when we change that white balance, it's changing everything from the sky to the snow to the cross itself. And maybe that's not the accurate way that we would like to do things. Maybe we can use some of our colour editing skills to bring a bit of life into different areas of this photograph rather than affecting the whole scene. So we're going to go down to our colour editor, and I'm going to go to the advanced colour editor, because what this allows us to do is pick out those areas that we just clicked on, and it brings these areas of colour that we've selected. So this blue area up here in the top left-hand corner of the screen, that we can see that those are the colours that we've highlighted. And we can go down to this useful little View Selected Colour Range tab down at the bottom here, and that will change every element of colour that we've selected to the colour that we've selected, and everything else to monochrome. So it's a useful way as we tweak this area of colour where we can see that the colours start to change as we manipulate this wheel. So we've got our point here that we've selected, and everything around that point we can drag out and see those colours change. So ideally with this area here, we only want to edit that area of sky that's the picture, the part of the picture that we selected. So I'm just going to manipulate this as much as I possibly can. So it is only that area of sky that is going to be affected by the changes that we make. So I'm going to come down here to our little sliders, and just to bring a bit more mood into this photograph, I'm going to take the lightness down a bit. Now, with anything in post-production, you don't want to go too far, because as you do, you can see that it affects far too much. You can also see that even though I've tweaked that little selection there, we've still got the area of the snow being affected as well, which I don't think is detrimental to this photograph, because I think the snow and that area of sky are sort of the similar sort of tone that we would like to affect. So we're going to take that brightness down ever so slightly. As I say, subtle changes make a big difference in any kind of post-production that you do. And I'm also going to just increase the saturation ever so slightly, just to bring a bit more of that blue back into the photograph, and maybe balance out some of those muddy yellowy colours that were being cast across the scene through the snow from the warm sun. We could change the hue as well, just to make it a bit more purple or a bit more cyany, but because I'm trusting my camera and that Pro Standard setting to get the colours right, I don't really want to affect the hue very much. So I'm going to deselect View Selected Colour Range. And what you can see here is we've brought a bit more life back into the blue notes of the sky and also the snow to make them crisp. But what we have done is we haven't affected any of that light in the sun. If I move the slider across there, it's not affecting that yellow area at all. So I'm going to make a second selection, and I'm going to select this area here around the yellow area. Again, I will go to our View Selected Colour Range, and you can see that it's only selected that yellow area. If I move that out a bit, you can see more of that appearing, especially on the cross. There's hardly any colour detail on the cross at all, but as I move that out, you can start to see those subtle warm tones on the cross. And I would like to keep those within the photograph. There's also some areas of orangey yellow here that are very subtle within the snow that we're going to have to be careful of. But when we come on to our colour grading section, we will be able to fit these into this photograph a bit better and make it a bit more accurate. So again, to increase the warmth a bit of this, I'm just going to warm that area up a bit more by adding a bit more saturation. I could take the lightness down again, just to again bring a bit more warmth into it. We could also change that hue. We could make it warmer by making it redder or cooling it down, but that's not what we want to do. As I say, I trust my camera's colour, and I trust Capture One in that Pro Standard profile to get the colour in terms of the hue pretty right, so I'm going to leave that be. We'll take off our View Selected Colour Range again, and you can see now that we've started to balance out and bring a bit more life into both the blues and also those warmer tones, again on the cross as well, because we had that within our selection. So now what I'm going to do is go down to our colour grading section. This is where we can split the shadows, midtones and highlights of our photograph to be able to change specific areas of the picture rather than just doing the white balance across the whole photograph. So I'm going to start off with highlights. And the issue that we have here is that there are a lot of highlights in this photograph because we've photographed the snow. So if I bend this colour wheel round, you can see that the majority of this photograph, apart from the cross maybe, and a few of those little details in the snow itself, are highlights. So the issue that we've got here is we don't want to overwarm this photograph and we don't want to overcool it down. So I'm going to add a new adjustment layer and call this snow. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag out on this layer a linear gradient coming out from the bottom of the photograph. So we are covering that area of snow. And within the highlights within this area, what I'm going to do is just bring this colour wheel round so it shows where I would like the colour of that snow to be, which is probably around there-ish. What I might want to do is increase or decrease the opacity of that layer. So if I want it to be more intense, darker, then I can pull it down. If I want it to be less intense, I can push it up and make it slightly lighter. And I think making it slightly lighter works quite well on this. I'm then going to drag out another layer and call this sky. And what I will do on this layer is do exactly the same, but pull it down from the more yellowy area of the sky, because I don't really want it affecting too much of that nice moody blue at the top left-hand corner. So with this, in the same layer level, I'm going to change those highlights so they become slightly warmer. So pulling it towards this yellowy orange area. So as you can see, we've not affected any of the snow colour in this colour grade at all because we've done that on our other layer. So we're just concentrating on those areas where we're pulling a bit of warmth back in where we need it and not pulling any warmth back into an area where we'd rather avoid it. So again, if I go to before and after, you can see that the change is very subtle indeed, but especially when we look at the snow, it is quite stark. We've gone from that muddy looking insipid colour to a much crisper, bluer, more natural looking snow scene. If I go back to our background layer, we can start to then put some more generic edits in terms of colour grading on the shadows and also the midtones in the scene. So with the shadows, what I would like to do is maybe just slightly warm these up because the shadows mainly fall on the cross, which we know is being hit by that sun. So ever so slightly, I'm going to warm those shadows up. In terms of the midtones, again, we can wheel our colour wheel around and see that there's quite a lot of those, and most of them fall within the areas that we'd like to keep cool. So the snow and the sky in that top left-hand corner. So I'm going to slightly cool these down a bit. Again, subtle differences make a huge amount of difference. I'm also going to push the brightness of those up slightly as well, just so we don't lose any of that nice contrast within the photograph. Again, a quick look at the before and after. And again, the change is very subtle, but very noticeable, especially with that warmth in the shadows on the cross there. I'm going to return to the highlights level because remember we only changed the highlights within those adjustment layers. We didn't change the highlights of the background. And I think that this photograph could benefit maybe from being cooled down slightly in the highlights, which hopefully shouldn't affect our sky too much, but it should bring a bit more natural feel to the snowy area. Again, I've only changed that ever so subtly. If we change this other slider on the other side, you can see that we changed the intensity of the level that we've made. But again, ever so subtle, but the amount of difference that it makes to the photograph is quite substantial in terms of the look that I want to get out of this photograph and the feeling that I had at the time when I made it. So one last check on the before and after. We've got on the left, the before, a muddy, very insipid scene, to after on the right, where we've kept the detail and the warmth of the sun in the sky, but slightly cooled that snow down to make it appear much crisper, much more natural, and to the naked eye, a bit whiter as well. This second photograph is a photograph that I made for one of my Thinking Photographically videos here on YouTube and the Yorkshire Photo Walks channel. It was taken up on Rombold's Moor in a woodland called Highmoor Plantation in West Yorkshire. And when I made this photograph, to me it was all about the mood and feeling that I had when I clicked that shutter. I loved the way that the mist came through the trees, and we've got this track leading towards a brighter area of misty woodland in the distance, which is just intriguing the eye to meander through this scene. But at the same time, it's quite foreboding as well. And sometimes colour grading can be just about getting that mood and feeling out of a photograph, getting our intention across. So looking at the colours in this photograph, again you'll notice that I've changed the colour profile to Pro Standard, which is the best for the camera and the software. And I've also done a few background changes to what the photograph looked like when I first took it. So you can see I've brought a bit more life and clarity and structure out of the scene, and maybe softened that dynamic range a bit. But the thing that's bothering me about this photograph in terms of colour to start off with is the vibrant nature of it. As I was walking through this woodland, it was quite dull and subtle in terms of what I was walking through, that the camera's really brought out the yellowy orange nature of the pine needles that are on the floor here. So I'm going to use my colour editor to pick out this area of yellowiness, and I'm also going to go back down to the view colour range little tab here, so we can see that the yellow colour of the pine needles has stayed as it is, and all of the trees and the mist around it has gone black and white. We have got a bit of an area on this tree here that is a bit yellow, but that's not going to be bothering me too much, because it's really the mass that we can see underneath the trees that is causing the issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncheck the colour selection, and I'm going to just desaturate it ever so slightly. Again, subtle adjustments go a long way. So you can see just by desaturating it, our eye starts to go away from these areas of vibrant colours in the foreground and is much more directed towards that light in the background there. So that's the only little element of colour editing that I'm going to do there, but we can do a bit of colour grading to bring a bit more of that mood back into this shot. So I'm going to start off with the highlights, which is going to affect that misty area. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cool that down ever so slightly. Again, not pushing it too far, but just making sure that that mist comes across as being that cool feeling that I had as I was walking through this woodland. It wasn't a warm day, as you can probably tell. It was quite chilly. So I want to get that feeling across. So I'm taking that ever so slightly towards the blue. Again, what I could do is change the opacity of that by just dragging this slider at the side here, but I think I quite like it where it is in the middle there. The other thing that I can now do is go to the shadows, which is going to affect a lot of these areas underneath the trees. Now, as you can see on a few of these foreground trees, it's quite green because on the trees there is a lot of moss and lichen. And I would like to get that feeling across the whole area of woodland rather than just these mid-ground trees. And as I said in the last photograph, I'm going to go a bit of the opposite way in terms of the shadows as I went to the highlights and warm them up slightly, but I'm also going to go slightly towards the green side rather than picking out, making it ridiculously too warm, which is going to also have the effect of bringing out some of that yellow and orange nature to the pine needles as well. So by taking it to the green side, we start to emphasize a bit of that moss and get a bit more of that mood back across in the photograph. Now, a lot of this photograph is highlights and shadows. The midtones are going to be quite subtle, but as you'll see as I move this around, they are there. And there are quite a lot of them, especially in the trees that are in the mid-ground to background area. And because they're there, I'm going to make sure that they are slightly cooler. Because again, I want to get the feeling of this mist across being quite cool and moody and foreboding. And that's going to have a positive effect on that subtle green change that we made in the shadows as well. So leaving the slider around there, I think really picks out the mood and feeling that I had when I made this shot in the first place. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I think it's really important to stress that colour grading and colour corrections aren't and shouldn't be a necessity for every single photograph that we make. I'm a great believer in the fact that getting our camera settings right in the camera, out in the field when we make the photograph, is imperative, because then it stops us from making those elaborate adjustments when it comes to putting our photographs through the post-production process. We can be a lot more subtle with the adjustments that we make. We've also got to remember that our eyes see the world very differently from our cameras. We can pick up those subtle differences in hue and tone and saturation in colour, where our camera might not be able to. The snowy example that I shared with you is a perfect example of that. It's in these situations where colour grading and colour correction can work really well, because we can use our camera to make that photograph in the first place, and then reapply our intent and how we saw that scene with our eyes using that post-production software. It's also a really good way of getting the mood and feeling back into your shots that your camera might not be able to pick up. What we've realised is that sometimes those general generic changes that we make, such as white balance and the hue and saturation of the whole photograph, sometimes don't go as far as we need them to go. And it's in those situations where it is time to turn to that colour correction and colour grading to get the look that we would like from that photograph. If you've enjoyed this video, then please give it a thumbs up. If you have your own opinions or would like to teach me more about Capture One and its capabilities, then please share those comments with me in that comment section below. If you'd like to learn more about photography from these videos, then please subscribe to the Yorkshire Photo Walks YouTube channel and remember to click on that bell icon to be reminded when we post a new video. If you'd like to learn practically out in the field, then check out YorkshirePhotoWalks.com, where we provide expert photographic tuition on short walks through unique and inspirational Yorkshire locations. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram by following @PhotoWalksYorks for all of our latest news and photo walk photographs. I've also recently updated my own personal photography portfolio website and launched a print shop as well, so some of the photographs that you see featured in these videos could be yours to put on your walls at home. How magical is that? For that, it's theflatcappedphotographer.co.uk. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you've got something from it, and I hope that next time you're out in a landscape and think, well, how can I get the colours to be exactly how I see them and to get my intent across? You can then come to your post-production software and implement some of those colour grading and colour correction tools we've talked about today. Until next time, thank you very much for watching.